Sometimes the cruelest wounds come not from enemies, but from those who should offer you shelter. Inga had left everything behind to marry a stranger and make peace between warring clans, only to find herself scorned in her own home. Her husband Eirik was known as the Bare-Hearted, feared in battle but gentle at home. Most people in the hall saw Inga as just another foreign bride with no real standing. Freydis, a rich widow, decided to put this outsider in her place. In front of everyone, she grabbed Inga's simple dress, tore it apart, and announced that servants' cloth didn't belong at the high table. Eirik saw everything. What Freydis didn't know was that this quiet woman had already saved her husband's life and earned his deepest respect. But what would the Bare-Hearted do when his wife's honor was attacked in front of the entire hall? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The great hall of Jarl Hroald stood like a fortress against the northern winds, its timber walls blackened by decades of hearth smoke and weathered by countless storms. Carved dragon heads gazed down from the rafters, their wooden eyes seeming to judge all who entered. This was a place where bloodlines mattered more than gold, where the right to sit at the high table was earned through generations of warfare and alliance. Inga had learned this truth within hours of her arrival 3 moons ago. The marriage ceremony had been swift, a political necessity wrapped in the thin veneer of celebration. She was the 3rd daughter of a chieftain from the eastern fjords, offered in marriage to seal a peace that had cost both clans dearly. Her new husband, Eirik Bjornsson, called the Bare-Hearted, was a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. At first glance, Eirik seemed carved from the very mountains themselves. Standing nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block doorways and hands that could crush stone, he was exactly what one would expect from a warrior who had never lost a battle. His beard, dark as winter soil and streaked with early silver, fell to his chest in intricate braids. Scars crisscrossed his massive forearms, testament to countless fights where lesser men would have fallen, yet it was his eyes that had surprised Inga most. Deep brown, almost amber in the firelight, they held a gentleness that seemed impossible in such a fearsome frame. When he had first spoken to her on their wedding day, his voice was soft, careful, like a man trying not to frighten a wounded bird. "I know this was not your choice," he had said, standing awkwardly in their new chambers. "But I hope in time we might find friendship in this arrangement." Friendship. Not love, not passion, not even duty, friendship. It was more than she had dared hope for. The hall itself reflected the complex nature of its inhabitants. The high table sat elevated on a wooden platform, carved from a single massive oak that had reportedly taken 20 men to move. Here sat Jarl Hroald, Eirik's uncle, a man whose political cunning had kept their lands safe through 3 decades of shifting alliances. To his right sat his son Magnus, heir to the Jarl's seat, whose ambitions were as sharp as his blade. To his left sat Eirik, and beside him Inga. Below the high table, arranged in careful order of precedence, sat the other noble families. Each position told a story of conquest, marriage, or favor earned through loyal service. The closer to the high table, the greater the honor. The farther away, the more tenuous one's hold on respect. Freydis the Proud occupied a seat of particular significance. As the widow of Chieftain Orm, she held lands in her own right, a rarity that she wielded like a weapon. Nearing 50 years, she had maintained her beauty through careful attention and fierce pride. Her hair, still golden, though helped by careful tending, was always perfectly braided. Her dresses were the finest silk, imported at great expense from distant lands. Most importantly, she had given her late husband 3 sons, all now warriors in their own right. Where Inga was quiet, Freydis was commanding. Where Inga chose simple woolen dresses in earth tones, Freydis favored rich fabrics in bold colors. Where Inga listened more than she spoke, Freydis filled silences with her opinions, freely given whether requested or not. A marriage alliance, Freydis had declared on Inga's first night, loud enough for half the hall to hear, is only as strong as the woman who seals it. Let us hope our new bride proves worthy of the bare-hearted. The comment had stung, though Inga had shown no reaction. She had learned early in life that responding to provocation often brought more trouble than ignoring it. Instead, she had focused on the carved drinking horn in her hands, running her fingers over the intricate knotwork while she listened to the conversations flowing around her. The other women of the hall had been more subtle in their assessment, but no less thorough. Inga felt their eyes following her movements, noting every gesture, every word. Did she know the proper forms of address? Could she manage the household duties expected of a chieftain's wife? Would she prove fertile, and if so, would her children be strong? These were reasonable concerns, Inga understood. She was an outsider in a world where loyalty was everything. Trust had to be earned, not assumed. Eirik had been patient with her uncertainty. When she hesitated over where to sit during meals, he would guide her gently to the proper place. When she struggled with unfamiliar customs, he would quietly explain, without drawing attention to her confusion. When others spoke of battles and raids she had not witnessed, he would lean close and whisper context so she could follow the conversation. His war hammer, Ironbreaker, hung always at his side, a massive weapon that few men could even lift, let alone wield effectively. The handle was worn smooth by his grip, and the head bore the dents and scratches of countless battles. Yet for all its fearsome reputation, Inga had noticed that Eirik never touched it in anger. It was a tool of necessity, not a symbol of cruelty. She had seen him use those same powerful hands to gently tend an injured bird, setting its broken wing with infinite care. She had watched him lift children onto his shoulders, becoming a gentle giant who delighted in their laughter. She had observed him, listening to the grievances of farmers and merchants with the same attention he gave to matters of war and politics. This was the man she had married, complex, thoughtful, carrying the weight of reputation and responsibility with quiet dignity. In another world, she thought, they might have had the luxury of courtship, of discovering each other slowly. Instead, they were learning to navigate marriage while the entire hall watched and judged their every interaction. The servants, at least, had begun to warm to her. Astrid, an older woman who managed the kitchens, had taken it upon herself to teach Inga the preferences of various household members. Young Harold, barely more than a boy, had shown her the best places to find quiet moments away from prying eyes. Even Gunnar, the gruff stable-master, had begun to nod respectfully when she passed, but respect from servants, while comforting, carried little weight in the hall's complex social hierarchy. What mattered was acceptance from the nobles, acknowledgement from the warriors, recognition from the other wives and daughters who held real influence. Inga understood that her position was precarious. She brought no great dowry, commanded no vast army, held no strategic lands. Her value lay entirely in the peace her marriage represented, and peace was a fragile thing. Should the alliance between the clans falter, she could easily become a scapegoat, blamed for failing to secure what her marriage was meant to guarantee. This knowledge shaped every choice she made. She dressed modestly, not wanting to appear above her station. She spoke carefully, not wanting to give offense. She worked diligently at learning the customs and expectations of her new home, hoping that competence might earn what birth had not provided. Yet despite her caution, or perhaps because of it, she felt the growing tension. Some in the hall saw her restraint as weakness. Others interpreted her foreign ways as arrogance. A few seemed to view her very presence as an insult to their traditions. Freydis was the most vocal of her critics, but she was not alone. Magnus had made several pointed comments about the wisdom of trusting outsiders. Sven the Red, a warrior who had lost friends in the conflict that led to this peace, watched her with open suspicion. Even some of the other women seemed to resent her quiet dignity, as if her refusal to be provoked was itself a form of provocation. Through it all, Eirik remained steadfast in his courtesy toward her. He never raised his voice in her presence, never criticized her attempts to adapt to their ways. never suggested that their marriage was anything but what it appeared, a necessary alliance that he approached with honor and respect. But Inga had begun to wonder if his kindness masked disappointment. Did he wish for a bride who could match Freydis's commanding presence? Did he long for someone who belonged naturally to this world of warriors and politics? Was his gentleness toward her simply the consideration any decent man would show to a guest in his home? These questions troubled her more than the obvious hostility from others. She could endure criticism and suspicion. She had expected both. But the thought that she might be a disappointment to the one person who had shown her kindness cut deeper than any insult Freydis might devise. As autumn deepened into winter, the hall had become her entire world. The thick walls that protected them from storms also confined them together, intensifying every tension and magnifying every slight. Soon, the snows would make travel impossible, trapping them all until spring's return. Whatever conflict simmered beneath the surface would have months to grow and fester. Inga could feel the pressure building like a storm front moving across the mountains. She sensed that something would soon force the question that everyone was thinking, but no one dared ask directly. Did she truly belong here, or was she simply an outsider playing at being one of them? The answer, she feared, would come sooner than she wished. The evening feast had begun, like any other. Torches flickered against the stone walls, casting dancing shadows that made the carved dragons seem alive. The smell of roasted meat and ale filled the air, mixing with the smoke from the great hearth. Conversations flowed in overlapping waves, stories of the day's hunting, discussions of upcoming trading expeditions, gentle arguments about the weather's turn. Inga sat in her customary place beside Eirik, wearing her wedding cloak over a simple dress of undyed linen. The cloak was beautiful, deep blue wool embroidered with silver threads in patterns that told the story of their clan's new alliance. It had been a gift from Jarl Hrold, a formal recognition of her status as Eirik's wife. Yet beneath its rich folds, her everyday dress was plain, practical, woven from wool she had spun herself in the months before her marriage. She had chosen to wear it tonight without much thought. The linen was soft and comfortable, dyed a gentle brown that reminded her of home. More importantly, it was her own work, every thread familiar beneath her fingers. In the hall where so much felt foreign, wearing something she had made herself provided a small comfort. Freydis had been drinking more than usual. Her cheeks were flushed, and her voice carried farther than normal as she regaled her table with stories of her late husband's victories. She wore silk tonight, a dress of deep green that shimmered in the firelight, clearly expensive and carefully chosen to display her wealth and status. "In my day," Freydis declared, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. A woman knew her place and dressed accordingly. We understood that how we presented ourselves reflected on our families, our husbands, our entire lineage. The comment seemed directed at no one in particular, but Inga felt several glances turn her way. She continued eating quietly, hoping the moment would pass. Experience had taught her that responding to indirect provocations usually made situations worse, but Freydis was not finished. Rising from her seat with the careful dignity of someone who had been drinking but was determined not to show it, she approached the high table. Her movement drew attention. Conversations quieted as people turned to see what she intended. "Jarl Hrold," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "I hope you will forgive an old woman's concern for the honor of this hall." Eirik's uncle looked up from his meal, his weathered face showing polite interest tinged with wariness. He knew Freydis well enough to recognize when she was building towards something. "Speak freely, Freydis. Your counsel has always been welcome here. I have been thinking about standards," she continued, moving closer to the high table. "About what we expect from those who sit in positions of honor. About how we present ourselves to guests and to each other." Inga felt Eirik tense beside her, though his expression remained neutral. His hand, she noticed, had moved almost imperceptibly closer to his drinking horn, a subtle sign of alertness that few would recognize. "These are worthy thoughts," Jarl Hrold replied carefully. "What specific concern brings them to mind?" Freydis smiled, an expression that managed to be both beautiful and cold. It grieves me to see the standards of this hall diminished. When I see servants' cloth at the high table, I wonder what message we send to our people. The hall had grown very quiet now. Even the servants had stopped moving, sensing the tension that was building like pressure before a storm. Servants' cloth? Jarl Hrold's voice carried a warning, but Freydis seemed too committed to her course to heed it. Indeed. She turned to look directly at Inga, her pale eyes glittering with malice disguised as concern. I would hate for anyone to think we no longer maintain proper distinctions in this hall, that we allow just anyone to sit where they please, wearing whatever they choose. Inga felt the blood drain from her face. Around the hall, she could see people leaning forward, eager to witness whatever was about to unfold. Some faces showed anticipation, others discomfort, but all were focused on this moment. Lady Freydis, Eirik's voice cut through the tension like a blade. Perhaps you have had enough wine for one evening. But Freydis was beyond stopping now. Whatever had been building in her for months finally demanded release. Have I, Eirik? Or have I finally found the courage to speak what others only whisper? Look at her dress. Plain linen, undyed, the sort of thing a kitchen maid might wear to scrub floors. Is this how a chieftain's wife honors your name? Before anyone could respond, Freydis reached out and grasped the sleeve of Inga's dress. The fabric, soft from years of wear, tore easily in her grip. The sound, a sharp ripping that seemed impossibly loud in the silent hall, hung in the air like an accusation. You see, Freydis held up the torn piece of linen as if it were evidence in a trial. Servant's cloth tears like servant's cloth. It has no place at the high table, worn by someone who claims to be one of us. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to burn more quietly, as if the flames themselves were holding their breath. Inga looked down at her torn sleeve, at the threads hanging loose where Freydis had grabbed her. Her wedding cloak had fallen open, revealing the full extent of the damage to her dress beneath. She could feel every eye in the hall upon her, waiting to see how she would respond. Would she weep? Would she rage? Would she flee in shame? The moment stretched endlessly, heavy with expectation and judgment. Instead, Inga carefully gathered the torn fabric and smoothed it as best she could. When she looked up, her face was composed, though those who knew her well might have noticed the slight tremor in her hands. You are right. Lady Freydis, she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. This is servant's cloth. I wove it myself before I came here. I wore it tonight because it reminded me of home, of the work of my own hands. Perhaps that was thoughtless of me. She stood slowly, maintaining her dignity despite the torn dress and the weight of all those staring eyes. If you will excuse me, I should change into something more appropriate. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of Eirik's face. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his massive hands had clenched into fists. His amber eyes followed her movement with an intensity that made the air itself seem to thicken. Inga. His voice stopped her at the edge of the platform. She turned back, uncertain what to expect. Around them, the hall remained frozen in tableau, Freydis still holding the torn fabric like a trophy, the other nobles watching with hungry eyes, the servants pressed against the walls, in uncomfortable witness to their betters' drama. There is no need for you to change, Eirik said, his voice carrying a weight that made several people shift uneasily. Wear what brings you comfort. This is your home now. Freydis opened her mouth to respond, but something in Eirik's tone, or perhaps in his posture as he slowly rose to his full imposing height, made her hesitate. But surely, she began. Lady Freydis. Jarl Hrold's voice cut through her words like an axe through wood. You have made your point. Perhaps it would be wise to make your apologies and return to your seat, but Freydis, emboldened by wine and months of building resentment, shook her head. I will not apologize for defending the honor of this hall. If others are too polite to speak truth, then someone must. Inga felt the moment crystallizing around her, all the tension, all the unspoken conflicts. all the questions about her place and worth coming to a head in this single confrontation. She could retreat now, could accept the humiliation and try to move forward. Or she could stand and face whatever was coming. She chose to stand. Lady Freydis speaks from concern for this hall's reputation, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. I understand that concern. I am still learning my place here, still proving myself worthy of the trust placed in me. If my choices tonight have fallen short of what is expected, I will do better. The response seemed to surprise Freydis, who had perhaps expected tears or anger rather than this quiet dignity. For a moment, she appeared almost uncertain, but then her chin lifted again, and her grip tightened on the torn fabric. Words are easily spoken. Actions reveal truth. And your actions tonight show that you still think like a servant, not like the wife of a warrior. The insult hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere and demanding response. Inga felt the weight of the moment, not just for herself, but for her marriage, for the alliance between their clans, for everything that had brought her to this hall and this life. And in that weight, she realized that Eirik had not yet spoken. She turned to look at her husband, this giant of a man who had shown her nothing but kindness, who had defended her quietly but consistently since her arrival. His face was a mask of controlled fury, his amber eyes fixed on Freydis with an intensity that would have made lesser mortals flee. When he finally moved, it was with the deliberate care of a landslide that knows exactly where it means to fall. Inga's chambers had become her sanctuary in the days following the incident. The room was modest but comfortable, with thick tapestries covering the stone walls and a small hearth that kept the northern cold at bay. In one corner stood her weaving loom, a wedding gift from her mother, carefully transported from her homeland despite the difficulty of the journey. The loom was more than furniture to Inga. It was a connection to everything she had been before becoming Eirik's wife. Made from seasoned oak and worn smooth by generations of women's hands, it had belonged to her grandmother and her grandmother's mother before that. Every inch of its frame told stories, small notches where tension had been adjusted, darker patches where countless threads had passed through guiding rings, shallow grooves worn by the rhythm of countless hours of work. She sat before it now, her fingers moving automatically through the familiar motions of weaving. The repetitive action soothed her nerves, while her mind processed what had happened in the Great Hall 3 days ago. Thread over, thread under, press the beater. Advance the warp. Each movement was a meditation, a way of finding peace in chaos. What troubled her most was not Freydis's cruelty. She had expected that from the moment she arrived. What troubled her was the memory of Eirik's face in those final moments, the controlled fury that had radiated from him like heat from forge fire. She had left the hall before seeing how the confrontation resolved, but she could imagine the aftermath. Men like Eirik did not forget insults to their wives, even wives they had married from duty rather than love. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Enter," she called, expecting to see Astrid with the evening meal. Instead, young Harold stepped inside, his thin frame dwarfed by the bundle he carried. The boy was perhaps 15, all elbows and earnest eyes, one of the servant children who had shown her kindness since her arrival. "My lady," he said, setting down his burden carefully. "Astrid thought you might want these back." Inga looked at the bundle with confusion until Harold carefully unwrapped it, revealing the torn dress from the feast. But it was no longer torn. Someone had mended it with tiny, precise stitches, using thread that matched the original fabric so perfectly the repair was nearly invisible. "Who did this?" she asked, running her fingers over the careful needlework. Harold shifted uncomfortably. "The kitchen women, my lady. They said it was a good dress, made with skill, and it deserved better than to be ruined by spite." The simple kindness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to Inga's eyes. In a world where her every action was scrutinized and judged, where her worthiness was constantly questioned, these women who truly did serve in the hall had quietly affirmed that her work had value. "Please thank them for me," she said softly. "This means more than they might know." Harold nodded, then hesitated. "My lady, there's something else. The women, they want you to know that they saw. They saw how you acted with dignity when she tried to shame you. They respect that." After the boy left, Inga held the mended dress in her lap, studying the careful stitches. The repair reminded her of something her mother had once told her. "The strongest fabric is not the one that never tears, daughter. It's the one that can be mended and continue to serve." Perhaps that was what she needed to learn about her place here. Not to be perfect, not to never face challenges to her worth, but to endure and continue serving her purpose despite the damage others might try to inflict. She thought back to her life before this marriage, trying to remember the woman she had been. Her father's hall had been smaller, less formal, but she had not been insignificant there. She had managed the household accounts, arbitrated disputes between servants, organized the storage of grain and supplies for winter. She had been valued for her practical intelligence, her ability to see solutions where others saw only problems. When raiders had threatened their coastal settlements 2 summers ago, she had been the one to suggest moving the livestock to higher ground and creating hidden food caches. When plague had struck their herds, she had organized the isolation protocols that prevented total loss. When the harvest failed due to early frost, she had calculated how to stretch their stores through winter without anyone starving. These were not the dramatic feats that earned places in songs, but they were real contributions, meaningful work that had saved lives and preserved their community. Why should her value be diminished simply because she now lived in a different hall? The weaving loom beside her seemed to echo that thought. Every thread in a tapestry mattered, even the plain ones that formed the foundation for more decorative elements. Without the simple threads, the beautiful patterns could not exist. Perhaps her role here was similar, to provide steady support rather than brilliant display. Yet even as she found comfort in this perspective, she knew that the incident with Freydis had changed something fundamental in the hall's dynamics. Lines had been drawn, positions taken. Whatever fragile acceptance she had been building was now threatened. She had heard whispers in the corridors, fragments of conversation that stopped abruptly when she appeared. Some spoke approvingly of her restraint and dignity. Others questioned whether a woman who would not defend herself could be trusted to defend the hall's interests. Still others debated whether Eirik's obvious anger at the situation was justified or excessive. The complex web of loyalties and obligations that governed the hall had been disturbed, and she was not yet skilled enough in its navigation to predict how the ripples would spread. Would other nobles take Freydis' side, seeing her as a defender of tradition? Would they rally to Eirik's defense of his wife's honor? Or would they simply wait to see which way the political winds blew before choosing their allegiance? What worried her most was the possibility that her presence was becoming a liability to the very peace her marriage was meant to secure. If defending her honor put Eirik at odds with significant portions of the hall, if her foreign ways continued to provide ammunition for those who opposed the alliance, then perhaps her greatest service would be to step back, to make herself smaller and less controversial. But even as the thought occurred to her, something in her spirit rebelled against it. She had not asked for this marriage, but she had accepted it with grace. She had not chosen to leave her home, but she had done so without complaint. She had not demanded respect or recognition, but she had conducted herself honorably in pursuit of it. To retreat now, to accept that she was indeed the lesser creature Freydis had named her, would be to betray not just herself, but everyone who had invested in this alliance. It would be to waste the sacrifice her clan had made in giving her up, the trust Eirik had shown in accepting her, the hope for peace that their union represented. Rising from her chair, she moved to the small window that looked out over the hall's courtyard. Below, she could see the daily life of the stronghold continuing, servants going about their duties, warriors practicing with sword and spear, children playing games that mimicked the adult conflicts around them. This was her world now, for better or worse. She had a choice to make: retreat into safe obscurity or step forward into whatever challenges awaited her. The decision, she realized, would define not just her future, but the kind of woman she chose to be in this new life. Her fingers traced the pattern of the mended dress one more time, feeling the strength of the careful stitches. Like the fabric, she could be repaired and continue to serve. But first, she needed to understand exactly what that service should look like. The morning after her decision brought an unexpected test. Inga had resolved to attend the dawn meal in the great hall, despite her uncertainty about the reception she might receive. She dressed carefully, choosing a gown of deep blue wool, well made but not ostentatious, and braided her dark hair in the style favored by the noble women of the hall. As she entered the great hall, conversations quieted momentarily before resuming at a more subdued level. She could feel the weight of attention, the careful assessment of her demeanor and appearance. This was her first public appearance since the incident with Freydis, and everyone would be watching to see whether she showed shame, defiance, or something else entirely. Eirik was already seated at the high table, breaking his fast with deliberate concentration. He looked up as she approached, his amber eyes searching her face for signs of distress. What he found seemed to satisfy him, for his expression softened slightly as he rose to help her into her chair. "Good morning, wife," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough warmth to be heard by those nearby. It was a small gesture, but in the hall's complex social environment, such details mattered enormously. "Good morning, husband," she replied, accepting a cup of weak ale from a serving woman who smiled encouragingly at her. As they ate, Inga became aware of a shift in the hall's atmosphere. Where before the incident she had been largely ignored, now she was the subject of obvious scrutiny. Some of it was hostile, particularly from Freydis's usual companions, but not all. Several of the younger noble women watched her with what seemed like curiosity rather than judgment. The most surprising reaction came from Thora, wife of Magnus the heir. A woman in her 30s with intelligent eyes and prematurely grey hair, Thora had previously been politely distant. Now she approached the high table with purposeful steps. "Lady Inga," she said formally, "I wonder if you might join me this morning in reviewing the household accounts. Your reputation for practical management preceded you, and I would value your insight on several matters." The invitation was clearly intentional, offered loudly enough for others to hear. By requesting Inga's advice on household management, a sphere where competence was easily measured, Thora was providing an opportunity for Inga to demonstrate her worth in concrete terms. Inga felt a surge of gratitude mixed with nervousness. "I would be honored to assist however I can, Lady Thora." The morning spent in Thora's private chambers proved enlightening in ways Inga had not expected. The household accounts were extensive, tracking everything from grain stores to the wages of seasonal workers, from the cost of imported goods to the value of livestock trades. It was complex work that required both mathematical skill and deep understanding of the hall's operations. "The previous manager died last winter," Thora explained as they spread ledgers across a wooden table. "Magnus has been handling it himself, but his talents lie more in warfare than arithmetic. Several discrepancies have appeared that we cannot resolve. As Inga studied the records, patterns began to emerge. The mathematical errors were relatively minor, addition mistakes mostly, where tired minds had miscalculated long columns of figures. But there were also systematic inconsistencies that suggested deeper problems. "Here," she said, pointing to a series of entries from the previous autumn. "The grain stores show significant withdrawals for emergency provisions, but there's no corresponding record of what emergency required them. And these payments for special services, they're substantial but vaguely described." Thora leaned forward, studying the entries Inga had identified. "Magnus mentioned concerns about theft, but we could never prove anything specific." Working together, they began to untangle the discrepancies. Inga's experience managing her father's household proved invaluable. She knew what questions to ask, what patterns to look for, how to cross-reference different types of records to reveal inconsistencies. By midday, they had identified several clear cases of embezzlement, mostly involving the storage manager who had died conveniently just before winter. More importantly, they had established systems for preventing such problems in the future. "Your father trained you well," Thora said with genuine appreciation. "This work would have taken Magnus months to complete if he ever managed it at all." "I enjoyed it," Inga admitted. "There's satisfaction in making order from chaos, in ensuring that resources are used wisely. Then perhaps you would consider taking over these responsibilities permanently. Magnus would be grateful, and the hall would benefit from your expertise." The offer was more significant than it might seem to an outsider. Household management was a position of real authority, involving daily decisions that affected everyone in the hall. It would give Inga a legitimate role, a way to contribute that would be visible and valuable to all, but it would also make her more visible to those who resented her presence. Success in the role would provide ammunition for supporters. Failure would be seized upon by critics as evidence of her unworthiness. "I would need to discuss it with my husband," Inga said carefully. "Of course, but I think you would find him supportive. Eirik values competence above all else." As they returned to the great hall for the midday meal, Inga felt a cautious optimism. The morning had shown her that not everyone in the hall viewed her with suspicion. More importantly, it had reminded her that she possessed skills of genuine value, ways to contribute that went beyond merely being a symbol of alliance. Eirik's reaction to Thora's proposal confirmed his wife's assessment. When Thora presented the idea publicly, explaining how Inga had already identified and solved significant problems, he nodded approvingly. "If Inga is willing to take on such responsibilities, the hall would be fortunate to have her expertise," he said. "I have seen her manage complex household matters with skill that many would envy." The endorsement was clear and public, adding his considerable authority to the proposal. Around the hall, Inga could see people reassessing their opinions, weighing this evidence of practical competence against their previous assumptions. But not everyone was pleased by this development. From her seat below the high table, Freydis watched the exchange with obvious displeasure. The older woman had built much of her influence on her reputation as an authority on household matters and social propriety. Having a foreign newcomer take over such important responsibilities threatened her position in the hall's hierarchy. "How interesting," Freydis said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall, "that we now turn to outsiders for guidance on managing our own affairs. I wonder what other traditions we might abandon in pursuit of novelty." The comment was carefully crafted, not quite an open challenge, but clear in its disapproval. It forced others to choose sides, support the practical benefits of Inga's expertise, or align with traditional preferences for keeping important roles within established families. Inga felt the familiar tension building again, the sense that every decision became a test of loyalty and belonging. She was beginning to understand that in this hall, nothing was simple, nothing was purely practical. Every action carried political weight. Every success or failure reflected on larger questions of power and precedence. Yet, as she looked around the hall, she saw more thoughtful expressions than hostile ones. The morning's work had demonstrated her competence in ways that were difficult to dismiss. Perhaps that was how she would earn her place here, not through dramatic gestures or perfect adherence to customs she was still learning, but through steady demonstration of her value. The path forward was becoming clearer, even if it promised to be difficult. She would take on the household responsibilities, would prove herself through work rather than words. And in doing so, she would force even her critics to acknowledge that foreign birth did not necessarily mean inferior capability. The real question was whether such practical victories would be enough to overcome the deeper currents of resentment and tradition that flowed through the hall like underground rivers, shaping the landscape in ways that were not always visible, but were always present. Winter settled over the hall like a heavy cloak, bringing with it the peculiar intensity that came when people were confined together for months at a time. Snow blocked the mountain passes, making travel impossible and trapping everyone within the thick walls until spring's return. In such conditions, small conflicts had a way of growing into larger ones, and minor grievances could fester into lasting resentments. Inga had been managing the household accounts for nearly a month, and the results spoke for themselves. The systematic improvements she had implemented were saving the hall considerable resources while ensuring that everyone's needs were met more efficiently. Even Jarl Hroald had commented approvingly on the reduced waste and better organization, yet her growing competence and influence seemed to make certain people more uncomfortable rather than less. Freydis had taken to making pointed observations about the dangers of changing too much too quickly, of abandoning proven methods for untested innovations. She never criticized Inga directly, that would have been too obvious, but her meaning was clear to anyone who chose to understand it. The tension came to a head during the preparation for the midwinter feast, the most important celebration of the long winter months. Inga had been working with the kitchen staff to plan the meal, calculating quantities and coordinating with the storage managers to ensure everything would be ready. It was complex work, requiring her to balance tradition with practical constraints while managing the expectations of dozens of people. She was reviewing the final preparations when Sigrid, Freydis's eldest daughter-in-law, approached with what appeared to be a simple question about seating arrangements. Sigrid was a sharp-faced woman in her late 20s who had inherited her mother-in-law's talent for disguising criticism as helpful concern. "Lady Inga," Sigrid said, her voice carrying just the right note of deferent politeness. "I wanted to ensure I understood the arrangements for tomorrow evening. I noticed that you've placed the Thornson family near the high table, closer than their usual position." Inga looked up from her lists, immediately sensing that this was not the innocent inquiry it appeared to be. The Thornson family held a minor but respectable position in the hall's hierarchy, loyal followers of Eirik, who had supported the alliance with her clan from the beginning. "The arrangement follows the traditional precedents," she replied carefully. "I consulted the records from previous celebrations to ensure accuracy." "Oh, I'm sure you did," Sigrid said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's just that some of the older families have expressed concern about changes to long-established customs. The Eriksons, for instance, have always sat in that particular section. They're wondering if their years of loyal service are no longer valued. It was expertly done, a challenge disguised as helpful information, designed to make Inga question her decisions while implying criticism from unnamed others. Worse, it touched on the sensitive issue of whether a foreign bride understood the hall's traditions well enough to make such determinations. Inga felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with these confrontations. But she had learned to recognize it now and to respond thoughtfully rather than defensively. She pulled out the seating charts she had prepared and spread them on the table. "Perhaps you could help me understand the concern," she said evenly. "Here are the arrangements from the past 5 years, as recorded by the previous household manager. The Thornsons have sat in this section for the last 3 celebrations, while the Eriksons have been positioned here, slightly closer to the hearth, which many consider a position of honor during winter celebrations." Sigrid studied the charts, her confident expression faltering slightly as she realized that Inga had indeed followed established precedent. But she recovered quickly, shifting to a different line of attack. Of course, written records don't always capture the subtleties of these arrangements. There are traditional understandings, family preferences that have developed over time. Perhaps it would be wise to consult with those who have been managing these events longer than... She paused delicately, leaving the sentence unfinished but its implication clear. "That's an excellent suggestion," Inga replied, maintaining her calm tone. "I would welcome the opportunity to learn from experienced guidance. Perhaps you could arrange a meeting with these knowledgeable families so we can discuss any concerns directly." The offer put Sigrid in an uncomfortable position. If she arranged such a meeting, she would have to produce specific complaints from actual people, rather than hiding behind vague references to unnamed critics. If she declined, she would appear to be manufacturing controversy where none existed. "Well," Sigrid said, clearly realizing she had been outmaneuvered, "I'm sure that won't be necessary. I was simply trying to be helpful, and I appreciate that," Inga said with genuine warmth. "Managing these traditions properly is important to all of us. If concerns do arise, I hope people will feel comfortable bringing them to me directly." After Sigrid left, Lily frustrated by her failure to create the expected conflict, Inga allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She was learning to navigate these political waters, to respond to challenges without being drawn into the kind of dramatic confrontations that her critics seemed to prefer. But the encounter also reminded her how precarious her position remained. Every decision she made was scrutinized for evidence of foreign influence or disrespect for tradition. Every innovation was viewed with suspicion, every mistake magnified into proof of her unworthiness. The pressure was beginning to affect her relationship with Eirik as well. He had been unfailingly supportive of her new responsibilities, defending her competence whenever questions arose. But she could sense his growing frustration with the constant need to justify her presence and authority to others in the hall. The previous evening, she had found him on the ramparts, staring out at the snow-covered landscape with an expression of deep thought. When she had joined him, he had spoken more freely than usual about the political currents swirling around their marriage. "They test you constantly," he had said, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. "Every decision, every word, every gesture is examined for weakness or foreign influence. It's not fair to you, and it's not good for the hall." "I understand their concerns," Inga had replied, though part of her resented having to be so understanding all the time. "I am an outsider, and change can be threatening." "You are my wife," Eirik had said firmly.
"That should be enough."
"The fact that they continue to question your place here reflects poorly on their respect for my judgment." She had heard the anger in his voice, carefully controlled but unmistakably present. It worried her because she knew that anger, however justified, could be turned against her if it led to open conflict with other noble families. Now, as she finalized the preparations for the midwinter feast, she found herself hoping that the celebration would pass peacefully. Perhaps if people could see her managing such an important event successfully, some of the doubts about her competence would finally be laid to rest. But experience had taught her to prepare for the unexpected. In the complex social environment of the hall, success often bred as much resentment as failure. Tomorrow's feast would not just be a celebration, it would be another test, another opportunity for her critics to find fault with her performance. As she rolled up the seating charts and gathered her other preparations, Inga reflected on how much her life had changed since the incident with her torn dress. She was no longer the quiet, uncertain bride, trying to find her place through invisibility. She had found her voice and her confidence, had proven her worth through concrete achievements. Yet she was also more aware than ever of the undercurrents of resentment and political calculation that shaped every interaction in the hall. Success had brought its own challenges, its own dangers. The question was whether she could continue to navigate them without losing either her integrity or her hard-won position. The midwinter feast unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, each element falling into place with the precision that came from thorough planning. The great hall had been transformed for the occasion. Tapestries displaying the histories of various families hung from the walls. The hearth blazed with logs that would burn through the night, and tables groaned under the weight of the finest foods the hall could provide. Inga wore her most formal gown, a creation of deep burgundy wool embroidered with gold thread that caught the firelight as she moved. The dress had been a wedding gift from Eirik's family, and wearing it tonight sent a clear message about her acceptance of her role and her respect for their traditions. The evening began well. Guests praised the organization, the quality of the food, and the thoughtful arrangement of seating that honored tradition while accommodating practical considerations. Even some of Inga's usual critics seemed grudgingly impressed by the seamless execution of such a complex event. But as the night progressed and ale flowed more freely, the careful politeness that had characterized the early hours began to fray. Conversations grew louder, laughter became more raucous, and the subtle tensions that always simmered beneath the surface of hall life began to emerge. The first sign of trouble came when Magnus, the heir, rose to offer a toast to the success of recent trading expeditions. His words were appropriate, but there was something in his tone, a slight emphasis on certain phrases that suggested deeper meaning. "To those who understand our ways," he said, raising his drinking horn high, "and who honor the traditions that have made us strong. May we never lose sight of what makes us who we are, no matter what changes winter winds might bring." The toast was met with enthusiastic approval from some quarters, more reserved responses from others. Inga felt the weight of many eyes upon her, measuring her reaction to words that seemed directed at her without mentioning her explicitly. She responded by raising her own cup and drinking deeply, showing no sign that she interpreted the toast as anything other than a celebration of the hall's strengths. But inwardly, she recognized the challenge being laid down, a suggestion that recent changes threatened traditional values, with herself as the implied agent of that threat. Eirik's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he followed his wife's example, drinking to his cousin's toast without comment. The moment passed, but its implications hung in the air like smoke. As the evening continued, Inga found herself observing the complex web of relationships that shaped the hall's social dynamics. She watched as various factions maneuvered for position, how old alliances were reinforced and new ones tentatively explored, how power flowed through channels both official and unofficial. Freydis held court at her table like a queen receiving petitioners. Despite having no formal authority, she wielded considerable influence through her network of relationships, her knowledge of family histories, and her reputation as a guardian of traditional values. Women sought her approval on matters of fashion and protocol, while men deferred to her opinions on questions of precedence and propriety. Tonight, Freydis seemed particularly animated, her voice carrying clearly as she shared stories of celebrations from years past. But Inga noticed that these reminiscences often contained subtle criticisms of recent changes, gentle lamentations for simpler times when things were done properly. "I remember when feast preparations were handled by those who had been born to understand our customs," Freydis said during one such story, her words pitched to carry beyond her immediate audience. There was a certain confidence that came from knowing you were following paths worn smooth by generations of wisdom. The comment was typical of Freydis's technique, nostalgic rather than directly critical, wistful rather than accusatory, but unmistakably pointed in its implications. It suggested that current arrangements, however competent they might appear, lacked the deep understanding that came only with proper breeding and long experience. Inga felt her cheeks warm with suppressed anger, but she forced herself to continue eating calmly. Responding to such indirect provocations would only give Freydis the confrontation she seemed to be seeking. Better to let the comment stand and trust that her successful management of the feast would speak louder than any defensive words. But the evening was far from over, and the challenges continued to mount. When the musicians began to play, calling for traditional dances, Inga found herself facing another test. The dances were complex, requiring knowledge of steps and patterns that were part of the hall's cultural heritage. A misstep would be embarrassing. Declining to participate might be seen as rejection of their customs. Eirik, sensing her uncertainty, offered his hand with a reassuring smile. "Trust me," he murmured, as he led her onto the cleared area that served as a dance floor. "Follow my lead and don't worry about perfection." His guidance proved invaluable. Though she stumbled occasionally, his sure movements and gentle corrections helped her navigate the unfamiliar patterns. More importantly, his obvious pleasure in dancing with her sent a clear message about his pride in their partnership. As they moved through the intricate steps, Inga began to understand something important about her husband. For all his fearsome reputation in battle, he was fundamentally a man who valued harmony and connection. The way he danced, strong but not dominating, confident but not showy, reflected the same qualities she had observed in their daily interactions. When the dance ended, they were both breathing hard and laughing. The moment of genuine joy between them was visible to everyone in the hall, and Inga could see approval in many faces. Whatever political calculations might divide the hall, there was something universally appealing about a couple who clearly enjoyed each other's company. But even this small triumph was soon overshadowed by a more serious development. As the evening wound toward its traditional conclusion with the sharing of the ceremonial mead, a messenger arrived from the outer settlements with news that cast a shadow over the celebration. "My lord," the messenger said to Jarl Hroald, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the feast, "I bring word from the eastern borders. There have been movements, armed groups crossing the boundaries we established with the Raven's Hollow clan." The hall fell silent as the implications sank in. The peace that Inga's marriage was meant to secure was being tested, possibly violated. All eyes turned toward the high table, toward the political alliance that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of border tension. Inga felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. If the peace failed, if her clan was seen as untrustworthy or unable to control their own people, then her marriage would be viewed as a failed strategy. More immediately, it would provide ammunition for those who had opposed the alliance from the beginning. "What is the nature of these movements?" Jarl Hroald asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Raiding parties, my lord. Small groups, but well-armed and organized. They've taken livestock and supplies from 3 settlements, always striking quickly and withdrawing before our patrols could respond." Magnus leaned forward, his earlier joviality replaced by the hard expression of a military commander. "This violates the terms of the peace treaty. If Inga's clan cannot control their own warriors, we don't know that these raids originate from her clan," Eirik interrupted, his voice carrying a warning that made Magnus hesitate. "Then who else would benefit from disrupting the peace?" Freydis interjected, her voice sharp with vindication. "Some of us warned that trusting outsiders was premature. Perhaps this is proof that some alliances are worth less than the parchment they're written on." The accusation hung in the air like a blade, transforming the evening's subtle tensions into open conflict. All the careful work Inga had done to establish her competence and worth suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of this challenge to the fundamental basis of her marriage. She could feel the hall's attention focusing on her, waiting to see how she would respond to this crisis that called into question everything she represented. The success of the feast, her growing acceptance among some of the hall's members, her careful navigation of political challenges, all of it could be swept away if she could not address this threat to the peace her marriage was meant to guarantee. But as she met the expectant gazes around her, Inga realized something that surprised her with its clarity. She was no longer the uncertain bride who had arrived months ago, hoping only to avoid giving offense. She had found her strength, her voice, her place in this complex world. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them not as a victim or a supplicant, but as a woman who had earned her right to stand at the high table. The question was whether that strength would be enough for what was coming. The council meeting convened at dawn, the great hall still bearing traces of the previous night's celebration. Empty cups and scattered rushes told the story of a feast that had ended in confusion and concern, rather than the traditional joy of midwinter. The carved dragons on the rafters seemed to leer down at the assembled nobles with particular menace in the grey morning light. Jarl Hroald sat in his high chair, his weathered face grave as he listened to additional reports that had arrived during the night. The raids were more extensive than initially reported. 7 settlements attacked over the past month, always by small, organized groups who struck swiftly and vanished before response forces could arrive. Inga sat beside Eirik, acutely aware that every person in the hall was measuring her reactions, looking for signs of guilt, complicity, or foreknowledge. She kept her expression carefully composed, while inwardly wrestling with confusion and growing dread. The attacks made no sense. Her father had sworn binding oaths to the peace, had sent her as surety for his word. Why would he risk everything they had worked to achieve? "The pattern is clear," Magnus declared, spreading rough maps on the table before them. "These are not random raids by desperate men. They're coordinated strikes targeting our most productive settlements, designed to weaken us economically while avoiding direct confrontation with our main forces." Freydis nodded approvingly from her seat. Exactly what one might expect from those who signed peace treaties they never intended to honor. Some people speak fine words about alliance while planning treachery in their hearts. The accusation was barely veiled, and Inga felt the familiar tightness in her chest. But before she could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the tension. "Actually," said Thora, Magnus's wife, her voice carrying a note of careful consideration, "the pattern suggests something else entirely. If you study the locations and timing, these raids don't make strategic sense for someone trying to prepare for renewed warfare." She moved to the maps, pointing to various marked locations. "Look, the attacks avoid our strongest defensive positions entirely. They take livestock and food supplies, yes, but they also seem to be probing our response times, testing how quickly we can mobilize forces. This isn't the work of Inga's clan preparing for war. This is someone else using the disruption to gather intelligence about our capabilities." A murmur of interest rippled through the assembled nobles. Thora's military insights were respected. She had grown up in a warrior family and understood tactical thinking better than many of the men present. "You're suggesting these raids are meant to implicate the eastern clans?" Jarl Hroald asked, his sharp eyes fixed on his daughter-in-law. "I'm suggesting that someone benefits significantly from the collapse of our peace treaty," Thora replied. "The question is, who has both the motivation and the capability to organize such a campaign?" Before anyone could respond, a commotion in the entrance hall drew their attention. Heavy footsteps echoed on stone, and voices could be heard in urgent discussion. Moments later, the hall doors opened to admit an unexpected visitor, Bjorn Ironhand, war chief of the Raven's Hollow clan and Inga's eldest brother. Inga's heart leapt at the sight of him, then immediately sank as she realized what his presence might mean. Bjorn was not a man who traveled lightly or without serious purpose. His appearance here in winter, with the raids casting suspicion on their clan, could only signal crisis. He was a massive man, even by the standards of their warrior culture, with the same dark hair and amber eyes that Inga had inherited from their father's line. His travel cloak was crusted with snow and ice, testament to the difficulty of his journey through winter storms. Most tellingly, he came armed for war, his great sword across his back, his mail coat visible beneath his furs. "Jarl Hroald," Bjorn said, his voice carrying the formal tone used for official communications between clans. "I come under the protection of guest right to speak of matters that concern both our peoples." The ritual words guaranteed his safety while in the hall, but they also indicated that he came as an official representative rather than a family visitor. Whatever news he brought, it was serious enough to risk winter travel and formal diplomatic contact. "You are welcome, Bjorn Ironhand," Jarl Hroald replied, matching the formal tone. "Speak freely of these matters that bring you to our hall in the deep of winter." Bjorn's eyes found Inga's for a moment, and she saw something there that chilled her. Sorrow mixed with grim determination. When he spoke, his words shattered everything she thought she understood about the situation. 3 weeks ago, my father received word that armed men claiming to serve this hall had attacked settlements along our western borders. The reports described warriors using your banners, speaking your battle cries, taking our people's livestock and stores. My father sent me to investigate these claims and, if necessary, to demand explanation for what appeared to be violations of our peace treaty. Stunned silence followed his words. The implication was staggering. Raids from both sides, each clan believing the other had broken faith, each preparing for renewed warfare based on false information. "That's impossible," Magnus said, his voice sharp with disbelief. "We have sent no raiding parties into your territory. Our forces have been defending against attacks from your people." "And we have sent no raiders into yours," Bjorn replied grimly. "Yet both our clans have suffered losses. Both have evidence of the other's supposed treachery. Someone is playing a very dangerous game with all our lives." The pieces of a larger puzzle began to fall into place with terrifying clarity. Inga saw understanding dawn on face after face around the hall as the implications sank in. Someone had been systematically working to destroy the peace between their clans, using false flag attacks to create exactly the kind of mutual suspicion and anger that would make war inevitable. "Who benefits from war between our clans?" Eirik asked, his voice deadly quiet. The question hung in the air as everyone considered the possibilities. A war between the eastern and western clans would devastate both sides, leaving them weakened and vulnerable. But it would also create opportunities for others, neighboring clans who might expand into the resulting power vacuum. Enemies who had been held in check by the alliance. "The Bloodaxe clan," Thora said slowly, naming their most persistent enemies. "They've been testing our borders for years, but the alliance with the eastern clans made direct assault too risky. If they could provoke us into destroying each other, they would inherit everything worth having from both our territories," Bjorn finished grimly. "And they have the resources to maintain false flag operations on this scale. Sven Bloodaxe has been gathering sellswords and exiles for months, claiming he was building strength for raids further south." The revelation transformed everything. Where moments before Inga had faced accusations of her clan's treachery, now she found herself part of an alliance under sophisticated attack by external enemies. The raids weren't evidence of her people's bad faith. They were proof of how successfully their mutual enemies had manipulated the situation. But the revelation also brought new dangers. If the Bloodaxe clan was indeed behind the false flag attacks, they had been planning this campaign for months, possibly years. They would not have invested such effort without confidence in their ultimate victory. Whatever they were planning, the raids were only the beginning. "How many of your warriors know the truth?" Jarl Hrold asked Bjorn. "Only my most trusted men. My father thought it wise to keep the full situation secret until we could determine the truth. If word spreads that we've been manipulated into suspecting each other, it might trigger the very war our enemies hope to achieve." "Smart," Magnus agreed grimly. "But it also means we're operating blind. We don't know how many of our own people believe the false reports, how close we are to open conflict despite knowing the truth." Inga listened to the discussion with growing dread. The sophisticated nature of the plot against their alliance suggested enemies who understood their weaknesses with disturbing accuracy. Someone had studied their clan relationships, their communication patterns, their likely responses to provocation. This wasn't the work of simple raiders or opportunistic neighbors. This was the product of careful planning, by people who understood exactly how to destroy the peace her marriage represented. More disturbing still was the realization that the attack had come very close to succeeding. If Bjorn had not made the difficult winter journey to investigate the reports personally, if either clan had responded to the apparent attacks with immediate retaliation, the alliance would already be in ruins. "The question now," Eirik said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "is how we respond. Our enemies expect us to turn on each other. Instead, we must find a way to expose their deception while protecting our people from further attacks. And we must do it quickly," Bjorn added. "My father can maintain the fiction of ignorance for only so long. Eventually, our warriors will demand action against what they believe are your attacks. If we cannot provide proof of the real enemy's involvement," he didn't need to finish the thought. Despite everything they now knew, despite the clear evidence of manipulation, the alliance remained fragile. Truth was not always stronger than perception. especially when that perception had been carefully crafted by skilled enemies. Looking around the hall at the faces of people who had been prepared to blame her clan for treachery, Inga realized that this crisis was both a vindication and a new beginning. Her marriage was no longer just a symbol of peace between former enemies. It was now the foundation for an alliance under active attack by forces that sought their mutual destruction. The question was whether that foundation would prove strong enough to support what was coming. The War Council that followed Bjorn's revelation stretched deep into the morning hours. Maps covered every available surface, marked with the locations of attacks, patrol routes, and suspected enemy positions. The hall had been cleared of all but the most trusted advisors, creating an atmosphere of intense focus and barely controlled urgency. Inga found herself in an unexpected position at the center of the planning. Her knowledge of both clans' territories, combined with her analytical skills honed through household management, made her insights valuable in ways none of them had anticipated. She could see patterns that others missed, connections between seemingly unrelated events that revealed the scope of their enemies' planning. "Look at the timing," she said, pointing to marks on the main map. "The attacks on our settlements here coincided exactly with raids on your territory here. That's not coincidence. It's coordination, designed to ensure both clans received news of the other's supposed treachery at the same time." Bjorn nodded grimly. "Which means they have intelligence networks in both our lands, people reporting on our patrol schedules and communication patterns." The implication sent a chill through the assembled leaders. The Blood Axe clan's operation was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. They weren't just conducting raids, they were running an intelligence campaign that had penetrated deep into both clans' territories. "We need to identify the informants," Magnus said, his voice hard. "Root them out before they can report on our response to this revelation." "Carefully," Jarl Roald cautioned. "If we move too aggressively, we risk exposing what we know. Better to feed them false information and use their networks against them." Eirik had been studying the maps with particular intensity. His massive frame bent over the tables as he traced possible attack routes with his finger. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-won military experience. "They're not finished," he said simply. "These raids were preparation for something larger. Look at what they've learned. Our response times, our defensive capabilities, the routes we use to move reinforcements. This is intelligence gathering before a major offensive." The observation cast the situation in an even more ominous light. If the false flag attacks were merely the opening phase of a larger campaign, then time was rapidly running out. Whatever the Blood Axe clan was planning, it would likely come soon, before their deception could be fully exposed. "How long do we have?" Thora asked, voicing the question that was on everyone's mind. "Not long," Bjorn replied. "My father is expected to respond to the supposed attacks within days. If he doesn't take action against your clan, his own warriors will begin to question his leadership. The Blood Axe conspiracy depends on maintaining the fiction that we're enemies. Then we need to act first," Magnus declared. "Strike at them before they can launch whatever they're planning." "With what forces?" Eirik asked pointedly. "Our warriors believe they're preparing to defend against attacks from the eastern clans. Bjorn's people think they're mustering for war against us. We can't reveal the truth without risking panic and confusion in our own ranks." The tactical problems were staggering. Both clans had substantial military capabilities, but those capabilities were currently aimed at each other rather than their real enemies. Redirecting them without exposing the deception would require extraordinary coordination and timing. Inga listened to the debate with growing frustration. The men were approaching this as a purely military problem, but she could see social and political dimensions that their warrior mindset was overlooking. Finally, she spoke up. "What if we don't try to hide the truth?" she asked. "What if we expose the deception publicly, dramatically, in a way that makes our people angry at the real enemies rather than each other?" The suggestion was met with skeptical looks. Revealing the truth carried enormous risks. If people didn't believe it, if they thought it was an excuse to avoid retaliation, the alliance could still collapse into mutual recrimination. How? Thora asked, her strategic mind immediately grasping the potential. A joint ceremony, Inga replied, the idea taking shape as she spoke. Bjorn and I are siblings, but we're also representatives of our clan's alliance. If we can prove the deception publicly, dramatically, our people will see themselves as victims of the same enemy rather than enemies of each other. And how do we prove it? Magnus challenged. We have theories and suspicions, but no concrete evidence that would convince skeptical warriors. It was Bjorn who provided the answer, reaching into his travel pack to produce a collection of items that he placed carefully on the table. Actually, we do have evidence. I brought these from the attack sites in our territory. The items were damning in their implications, pieces of equipment and weapons that bore the markings of Jarl Hrold's forces, but with small details that marked them as clever forgeries. A sword with the right maker's mark, but the wrong metal composition. A shield with accurate heraldry painted over different colors. Spear points that looked authentic, but showed tool marks from different workshops. I suspected something was wrong when I examined these personally, Bjorn explained. The forgeries are good but not perfect. A warrior familiar with our genuine equipment would notice the differences. This is proof of the deception, Eirik said, studying the false evidence with professional interest. But will it be enough to convince people who want to believe in treachery? The question hung in the air as they contemplated the magnitude of what they were attempting. Changing the narrative required more than just evidence. It required theater, drama, a revelation that would be emotionally compelling as well as logically convincing. We need witnesses, Inga said slowly. People from both clans, seeing the evidence together, understanding that they've all been deceived by the same enemies. A gathering, Thora agreed, building on the idea. But it would have to be carefully managed. If word leaks before we're ready, it won't, Bjorn interrupted. My father can call for a formal parley to address the supposed attacks. That's expected, traditional. Your people will see it as either preparation for war or negotiation for peace, depending on their perspective. And during this parley, Jarl Hrold asked, his weathered face showing cautious interest in the developing plan. We reveal the truth, Inga said firmly. All of it. The false flag attacks, the forged evidence, the identity of our real enemies. But we do it in a way that channels anger toward the Bloodaxe clan rather than each other. The plan was audacious, risky, and dependent on precise timing and execution. But as they discussed the details, it began to take on a coherence that offered hope. If they could pull it off, if they could transform their people's anger into unified purpose, they might not only preserve the alliance, but strengthen it beyond anything that had existed before. Yet even as they planned, disturbing reports continued to arrive. Scouts brought word of unusual activity in Bloodaxe territory, large groups of warriors moving under cover of darkness, supplies being stockpiled in forward positions, siege equipment being prepared. Whatever offensive they were planning was clearly imminent. We have perhaps 3 days, Magnus estimated, after reviewing the latest intelligence. After that, they'll be in position to strike regardless of whether our clans are fighting each other. The timeline was brutally tight. They needed to organize a parley, gather representatives from both clans, prepare their revelation, and coordinate their response to the real threat, all while maintaining the fiction that they still suspected each other of treachery. As the planning session finally broke up in the early afternoon, Inga found herself walking the ramparts with Eirik, both of them needing air and space to process the magnitude of what they faced. The winter landscape stretched before them, beautiful and harsh, dotted with the settlements that depended on their leadership for protection. Are we attempting the impossible? She asked, voicing the doubt that had been growing in her mind. Eirik was quiet for a long moment, his amber eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for answers in the snow-covered hills. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom, perhaps. But the alternative is certain failure. If we do nothing, The Blood Axe clan succeeds in destroying the alliance and conquering both our territories. If we attempt this and fail, we're no worse off than we would be otherwise. And if we succeed, we transform this crisis into the foundation for something stronger than either clan could achieve alone. Your marriage was meant to create peace between former enemies. Now it may become the symbol of alliance against common foes. The observation carried a weight that went beyond military strategy. Inga realized that her role in the coming confrontation would be far more significant than she had initially understood. She was no longer just a bride offered to seal a political agreement. She was becoming a symbol of unity, a bridge between peoples who had learned to see each other as allies rather than threats. "I'm frightened," she admitted, surprised by her own honesty. "Good," Eirik replied with a slight smile. "Fear keeps you careful. Overconfidence kills." As they stood together on the ramparts, watching the sun begin its early descent toward the western mountains, Inga felt the weight of the coming days settling on her shoulders. Everything she had worked to build, her marriage, her place in the hall, the fragile peace between their peoples, would be tested in the crucible of the next few days. But she also felt something she had not expected: excitement. For months, she had struggled to find her place, to prove her worth, to overcome the suspicions and prejudices that surrounded her foreign birth. Now she had the opportunity to do something genuinely significant, to play a role in preserving not just her marriage, but the peace and prosperity of both their peoples. The question was whether she would prove equal to the challenge. The great meadow outside the hall had been transformed into a formal parley ground, marked by ancient stones that had witnessed countless negotiations between clans over the generations. Two pavilions faced each other across the ceremonial space, one flying the banners of Jarl Hroald's people, the other displaying the colors of the eastern clans under Bjorn's leadership. The symbolism was deliberate and powerful. Every person present understood that they were witnessing either the preservation or the final destruction of the peace that had cost so much to achieve. Warriors from both sides stood in careful formation, hands near weapons, but not quite threatening, their faces showing the tension of men prepared for either diplomacy or battle. Inga stood between the pavilions, wearing her finest gown and her wedding cloak, positioned deliberately as the living symbol of the alliance between their peoples. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, measuring her composure, looking for signs of guilt or innocence, strength or weakness. Behind her in the western pavilion sat Jarl Hroald and his council, their faces grave with the responsibility of the moment. Eirik stood at her right shoulder, his massive presence both comforting and intimidating. His warhammer hung at his side, not quite a threat, but certainly a reminder of the consequences should diplomacy fail. Across the space, Bjorn commanded the eastern delegation with the quiet authority that had made him war chief of their clan. Their father, Chieftain Ragnar, sat in the place of honor, his weathered face showing nothing of the complex deception they were about to expose. The performance had to be perfect. Any hint that this was orchestrated rather than genuine could destroy their credibility. "We come to speak of grievances and accusations," Jarl Hroald declared, his voice carrying clearly across the meadow, "of raids and violations that threaten the peace our children sealed with their marriage. We come to hear explanations for attacks on our people," Chieftain Ragnar replied with equal formality, "and to determine whether the bonds of alliance can survive such betrayals." The ritual words masked the complexity of what they were actually attempting. Both leaders knew the truth, but their people did not. The gathered warriors and nobles had come expecting either negotiation or preparation for war, not the revelation that would transform their understanding of everything that had happened. Inga took a deep breath, feeling the moment crystallizing around her. This was the culmination of everything she had worked toward since arriving at the hall. Not just acceptance or respect, but the opportunity to serve a purpose larger than herself. "Before accusations are made," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, Perhaps we should examine the evidence of these supposed betrayals, she gestured to Bjorn, who stepped forward carrying the bundle of forged weapons and equipment they had prepared. As he unwrapped the items and displayed them for all to see, murmurs rippled through both delegations. These were found at the sites of attacks on our territory, Bjorn announced. Items bearing the marks and symbols of the Western clans, left behind by raiders who claimed to serve Jarl Hrold. The display created exactly the reaction they had hoped for: angry mutters from the Eastern warriors, defensive protests from the Western nobles. The evidence looked damning, exactly the kind of proof that would justify retaliation and the collapse of the alliance. But if you examine them closely, Inga continued, moving to stand beside the displayed items, you will see that something is not as it appears. She lifted one of the forged sword blades, turning it to catch the light. This bears the maker's mark of Cole the Smith, who has forged weapons for the Western clans for 20 years. But Cole's work has a distinctive pattern in the metal folding. See these lines here? This blade shows a different technique entirely. The observation drew closer attention from warriors on both sides. Men who lived by their weapons, understood the differences between Smith's work, could recognize the subtle variations that mark different makers and methods. Eirik stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of a warrior who had tested countless weapons in battle. Moreover, this shield shows the heraldry of my uncle's house, but painted over different colors. See here where the paint has chipped. Beneath the red, there's blue. Our shields have never been blue. The revelations created a stir of confusion and growing suspicion. Warriors began examining the evidence more carefully, pointing out discrepancies that became obvious once they knew what to look for. "What are you suggesting?" demanded one of the Eastern nobles, his hand moving instinctively toward his sword. "I'm suggesting that we have all been deceived," Inga replied, her voice growing stronger with conviction. "That someone has worked very hard to make us believe in each other's treachery when the real enemy lies elsewhere." Before anyone could respond, the sound of horns echoed across the meadow, not the formal signals of the parley, but the urgent calls that meant danger approaching. Scouts came running from the perimeter, their faces grim with news that would validate everything Inga and her allies had been preparing to reveal. Armed forces approaching from the north, the lead scout reported breathlessly. Large numbers moving in battle formation. They fly the banners of the Bloodaxe clan. The timing was perfect. Whether by luck or enemy design, Sven Bloodaxe had chosen this moment to reveal his hand, appearing just as the deception was being exposed. The coincidence was so dramatic that it seemed almost orchestrated, providing exactly the proof needed to validate the claims about manipulation and false flag attacks. But it also meant that the time for revelation and explanation had just run out. The real enemy was here, in force, ready to capitalize on whatever chaos they had created between the two clans. The transformation was instantaneous and electric. Where moments before two groups of warriors had faced each other with suspicion and barely controlled hostility, now they wheeled as one to face the true threat approaching from the northern hills. The forged evidence lay forgotten as the reality of their situation became undeniably clear. Sven Bloodaxe had timed his appearance with the precision of a master strategist. His forces crested the ridge in perfect battle formation. 300 warriors in organized ranks, their weapons gleaming in the afternoon sun, their war banners streaming in the cold wind. At their head rode Sven himself, a giant even by northern standards, his blood-red cloak marking him as clearly as any banner. "Now you see the truth," Inga called out, her voice carrying across the meadow with surprising strength. "While we accused each other of treachery, our real enemy prepared to destroy us both." The impact of her words was immediate and profound. Warriors who had been ready to fight each other suddenly understood that they had been played like pieces on a game board, manipulated into position for exactly this moment, when their forces would be divided and their attention focused on the wrong enemy. Jarl Hrold rose from his seat in the pavilion, his weathered face showing grim appreciation for the tactical situation. "They expected to find us already at each other's throats," he said, his voice carrying to both delegations. "Instead, they find us united and prepared, but even united their situation was precarious. The parley had brought representatives from both clans, but not their full military strength. The forces present were significant, but not overwhelming. Perhaps 200 warriors total, facing an enemy that outnumbered them and had chosen the time and place of battle. "We need to get word to our main forces," Magnus said urgently, already calculating distances and response times. "No time," Eirik replied, his warrior's instincts reading the approaching threat with professional clarity. "They'll be on us before we can organize a proper defense. We fight with what we have." Bjorn nodded grimly, drawing his great sword in a motion that was echoed by warriors throughout both delegations. "Then we make sure they regret choosing this day for their treachery." The enemy formation was impressive. Sven had clearly spent months preparing for this moment, gathering not just his clan's warriors, but sellswords and exiles from across the northern lands. They moved with the discipline of professional soldiers rather than the loose organization of typical raiders. But they had made one crucial miscalculation. They had expected to face confused, divided forces still arguing about imaginary betrayals. Instead, they found themselves confronting warriors who understood exactly who their real enemy was and why this battle mattered. Inga found herself in the center of the defensive formation as the two sides rapidly organized for battle. She should have been terrified. She had never been in combat, had never seen violence on this scale, but instead she felt a strange calm descending over her. This was what all her struggles had been leading toward. The moment when her presence would either justify the alliance or prove its failure. "Stay close to me," Eirik commanded, his warhammer now in his hands, the massive weapon seeming almost natural in his grip. "Whatever happens, we protect what we've built." The charge, when it came, was thunderous. 300 voices raised in the blood-axe war cry, 300 sets of hooves and feet pounding across the meadow. 300 weapons raised to destroy everything Inga's marriage represented, but the allied forces did not break. Eastern and Western warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping in formations that had been practiced for generations, their spears forming a bristling wall of steel points. The unity that had been theoretical moments before became viscerally real as men who had been prepared to fight each other instead fought for each other. The clash was tremendous, the sound of shield meeting shield, spear point striking mail, the grunts and shouts of warriors locked in deadly combat. Inga watched Eirik wade into the melee like a force of nature, his warhammer crushing through enemy shields and armor with devastating effect. But it was Bjorn who provided the moment that would be remembered in songs for generations. As Sven Bloodaxe himself pressed forward, seeking to break the allied line through sheer force of personality and skill, Bjorn met him in single combat that seemed to embody the larger conflict. The two giants circled each other while the battle raged around them, their weapons ringing against each other in a deadly dance. Sven was skilled and experienced, his reputation earned through decades of warfare. But Bjorn fought not just for victory, but for vindication, for proof that the alliance was worth preserving, that the peace his sister's marriage represented was stronger than the chaos their enemies sought to create. When Bjorn's blade finally found its mark, sliding past Sven's guard to pierce his heart, the symbolic impact was as important as the tactical one. The Bloodaxe warriors, seeing their leader fall, began to waver in their assault. "Sven Bloodaxe is dead," Inga shouted, her voice cutting through the din of battle. "Your leader is fallen. Surrender now and live or die with his lies." The offer of mercy in the moment of victory was calculated to have maximum impact. Warriors who had been fighting for gold and the promise of plunder suddenly faced the reality that their employer was dead and their cause lost. The psychological effect rippled through their ranks faster than any physical assault could have achieved. Within minutes, the organized Bloodaxe attack had collapsed into scattered groups of men seeking escape rather than victory. The alliance had not just survived its first real test, it had emerged stronger than ever, forged in the crucible of shared combat against a common enemy. But even as the immediate threat ended, Inga knew that the real work was just beginning. Spring came early that year, as if the land itself celebrated the peace that had been preserved and strengthened through trial by fire. The great hall wore new tapestries, gifts from the eastern clans, to commemorate the alliance that had proven stronger than treachery. But the most significant change was not in decoration, but in atmosphere. Where once there had been careful politeness masking underlying tensions, now there was genuine warmth born of shared struggle and mutual respect. Inga stood at the high table, not as a foreign bride hoping for acceptance, but as a woman who had earned her place through wisdom, courage, and unwavering commitment to the peace her marriage represented. The torn linen dress from that terrible night months ago hung now in her chambers, not as a reminder of humiliation, but as a symbol of how something damaged could be made stronger through careful mending. The celebration feast that marked the spring planting was unlike any the hall had ever known. Representatives from both clans sat integrated throughout the hall, rather than in separate sections, their children playing together while their parents shared stories of the battle that had forged their alliance in blood and victory. The artificial divisions that had once seemed so important now appeared petty in the face of what they had accomplished together. A toast, called Jarl Hrold, rising from his seat with a drinking horn in his weathered hands. To alliances that prove stronger than the enemies who would destroy them, and to those who had the wisdom to see truth through deception. The toast was echoed throughout the hall, but Inga noticed that many eyes turned to her as the words were spoken. She had become something she had never expected to be, not just a symbol of peace between clans, but an active architect of that peace. Freydis approached the high table as the evening progressed, her face showing an expression Inga had never seen before. Genuine humility mixed with something that might have been respect. The proud widow, who had once torn her dress in public scorn, now stood before her with careful dignity. "Lady Inga," Freydis said, her voice carrying clearly in the nearby conversations, "I owe you an apology that has been too long in coming. I saw foreign birth where I should have seen strength, simplicity where I should have recognized wisdom. You have proven yourself worthy of honor that I was too blind to offer." The apology was public and complete, witnessed by many who had once shared Freydis's doubts. It represented not just personal reconciliation, but a broader acknowledgement of how wrong the initial judgments had been. "Thank you, Lady Freydis," Inga replied with grace that showed no trace of vindictiveness. "We have all learned much about the difference between appearance and truth. What matters now is what we build together going forward." The response drew approving nods from throughout the hall. Mercy and victory was a virtue that warriors particularly respected, and Inga's willingness to accept the apology without demanding further penance showed the kind of leadership character that inspired loyalty. As the evening continued, Inga found herself in conversation with Thora about plans for the coming season. The household management responsibilities had expanded naturally into broader administrative duties, coordinating not just the needs of one hall, but the supply and communication requirements of the enlarged alliance. "The eastern settlements have expertise in livestock breeding that could benefit our farmers," Thora noted, reviewing reports that had become far more detailed since the alliance's strengthening. "And our metalworking techniques could improve their weapons and tools significantly. Trade follows trust," Inga agreed, seeing the larger pattern emerging. "As our people work together, they'll discover advantages that go far beyond military cooperation." The observation reflected a truth that was becoming apparent throughout both territories. The alliance, forced by necessity, was revealing opportunities that neither clan had imagined when working alone. Shared knowledge, combined resources, and coordinated planning were creating prosperity that exceeded what either group had achieved independently. Later, as the celebration wound down and guests began to retire, Inga found herself walking the ramparts with Eirik as had become their custom. The spring air was soft and warm, carrying the sense of new growth and the sounds of life returning to the land after winter's harsh grip. "Do you ever regret it?" Eirik asked as they paused to look out over the moonlit landscape. "The choice to come here, to leave everything familiar for this life." Inga considered the question seriously, thinking back over the months of struggle and growth that had brought her to this moment. The frightened girl, who had arrived as part of a political bargain, seemed like a different person now. Someone she could remember but no longer fully recognize. "I regret the pain it caused at first," she said honestly. "The uncertainty, the feeling of not belonging, the constant need to prove myself worthy of basic respect. But the person I've become through facing those challenges, no, I don't regret that." "And us?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability that few people ever heard from the bare-hearted. "This marriage that began as duty, what has it become?" She turned to face him, seeing in his amber eyes the same gentleness that had surprised her on their wedding day, now deepened by shared trials and mutual respect. Their relationship had indeed begun as duty, but it had grown into something richer and more complex. "Partnership," she said after a moment. "Trust, affection born of truly knowing each other rather than the passion of initial attraction. Perhaps that's a stronger foundation than the alternative." He smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "I think you may be right. We've built something that can weather storms because we built it deliberately, thoughtfully, with full awareness of what we were creating." As they stood together in comfortable silence, Inga reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place. She had come to this hall as a reluctant bride, hoping only to fulfill her duty without bringing shame to her family. She had found instead a purpose larger than herself, a role that challenged her to grow beyond what she had ever imagined possible. The torn dress hanging in her chambers would always remind her of the woman who had endured humiliation with dignity. But the tapestries in the great hall, woven with threads from both clans, told a different story, one of strength found through unity, of peace preserved through courage, of love that grew from respect rather than mere attraction. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to strengthen what they had built. But tonight, standing beside the man who had become her true partner, looking out over lands that were finally, genuinely at peace, Inga felt the deep satisfaction that came from knowing her life had meaning beyond her own happiness. She had found her place not by diminishing herself to fit into existing expectations, but by growing large enough to help reshape those expectations into something better. The foreign bride had become a true leader, and the alliance sealed by marriage had become a foundation for prosperity that would benefit generations yet to come. The story that had begun with a torn dress had become a testament to the power of dignity, a courage, and the patient work of building something lasting from the materials of duty and hope.